Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. In this video we are going to be taking a look at some 3D platform games as cunningly hinted to in the title of the video and thumbnail. Now this was actually quite a tricky one to narrow down as there's a ton of them out there, and also it was tricky sometimes to know where to draw the line between 3D platform game and just a 3D action adventure game. I kind of went with the whole platform games having an emphasis on collecting stuff. Yeah, that was my extensive process. But anyway, you don't care about that, you're here for games. So how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games, because we've got a lot to go through. Let's start on the Sega Saturn, because I don't talk about my Saturn enough. Here is Croc, Legend of the Gobbos, also released for the PC and PS1. Once I'd remembered how to load the game properly to stop the glitch of Croc's head not being visible, which is a common thing for the UK version of the game, I managed to get playing properly. And it's a 3D platform game, which I'm sure you all know by now, started out as a Yoshi game from Argonaut until Nintendo said no, bugger off, and they had to rework it into its own thing. So you are Croc, a Yoshi lookalike who has to stop the evil Baron Dante from capturing and taking over all the Gobbos' land. The Gobbos have been taken and put in cages which you'll need to smash open to rescue them from, or sometimes you'll need to find a key. You've got to explore a decent amount of small to medium sized levels that are packed with enemies, items to collect, platforms to navigate and creatures to rescue. He's got a few moves that you can use to get around as well. You can of course run and jump, and to attack enemies you've got a tail whip, which is actually really good and the hit detection is great. Most enemies only take 1 or 2 hits and have a fairly simple pattern to watch, but they will respawn, so be careful. You collect crystals which act the same as Sonic's rings do, so if you have at least one and you take a hit you won't die, you'll just lose them, but take a hit when you don't have any and you're toast. Platforming is of course the main focus here though, and there's a lot of it. Thankfully it's actually pretty good, but not perfect. Croc does control well, but the game uses tank controls which can make precision tricky. You can strafe with the shoulder buttons, and you do have a button dedicated to make you turn around and do a 180 quickly, which comes in a lot handier than you'd think. You'll be jumping over bottomless pits, lava pools, icy water, spikes and the usual platforming stuff, but it's all good. You'll also need to collect coloured gems to open a door at the end of the level that takes you to a bonus stage. These are often hidden in boxes that you'll need to butt drop on or in hard to reach places. Every few levels you'll fight a boss, and these are always fun to do, and you'll need to learn their patterns. The main issues with the game for me are the camera, which is probably coming as no surprise. It's fine, but you have little to no control over it. For the most part it stays behind you, which is good, and you do have a decent shadow that helps you with your landing your jumps. The music and sound are a bit disappointing here. The music is very short loops and just sounds like stock music to me. There's some okay ones in there, but not many. And the sound effects do sound like cheap stock ones you get in quite a few games as well. It all looks alright though, and I really like some of the animation on Croc, especially when he runs. This did get a sequel on the PlayStation, but I haven't played that one. But you know, I actually quite enjoyed what I played of this one, and I think I might go back to finish it. Here is Ninja Penguin Manmaru, also for the Sega Saturn, which apparently is based on the manga. You are the titular ninja penguin, and there is a story, but it's all in Japanese, so I don't really know what it's all about. But I assume that you're a ninja in training, and there are cutscenes where various creatures shout at you for 5 minutes or so, but I skipped them for after not too long. The gameplay here is fun though, if a little stiff. You are put in a bunch of quite small 3D levels that are filled with platforms and monsters, and your goal is to get to the exit platform on the stage. But it's never that easy, as you don't really know where the platform is and you'll need to do a lot of exploring. Each level is packed with floating platforms that you'll need to find your way around in order to get to the end. You only need to worry about running and jumping. This can be tricky though, thanks to the momentum of the stupid penguin. You never stop on a dime, so you'll need to plan your runs and jumps carefully so that you don't fall off the edges of platforms, which you will do a lot. This also has sort of tank controls, but only when you're moving. This could make turning tight corners tricky, and if you run into walls or obstacles then you fall over, which is cute at first but gets annoying quite fast. There's coins to collect in the levels, get enough and you'll get an extra life. And there's other power-ups as well, but they're not all good ones. So some will make you slower, some make you unable to jump for a while. But then there's the ones that make you faster or jump higher. They all only last a few seconds though, so it's never too bad if you do get a crappy one. Levels have a few enemies, but not a whole load. As far as I can tell, you just have to avoid them, at least in the early stages. You have a sword on your back, but you can't use it, though avoiding enemies isn't too hard, they just sort of wander about a bit. Eventually I got to a stage where I was against another ninja on a level filled with coins, and you both had to collect as many as you could, and once they were all taken, whoever had the most was the winner. This was as far as I could get, as I found this level incredibly hard and I lost all of my lives trying to complete it, and I just couldn't beat it. And really, I wasn't all that bothered enough to go back and try. The game is fun to play though, even though the controls aren't the best. It looks decent with some nice colourful Saturn 3D graphics. While I wouldn't say this is a must play, it can be fun in small doses if you like cute 3D platform games, of which there aren't actually too many on the Saturn. Bug was an early game for the Saturn and one that I always wanted to play, even before I owned the Saturn, which I only got last year by the way. This was the first game I got with it, along with Die Hard Trilogy and Sega Rally. Anyway, Bug is a 3D platform game that takes place within a movie, so I guess none of what happens is real or actually matters. Bug is an actor and his movies require him to navigate some narrow 3D platforms and paths until he finds the exit of the level and moves on to the next one. Wouldn't that be a riveting film? The levels here are massive though and can easily take upwards of 30 minutes to complete a single stage. You don't have full 3D control of Bug, but you can move left, right, forwards and backwards away from or into the screen. You have very fixed paths to follow and each level is basically just a maze. There's a ton of enemies on each stage and you can jump on most of them to defeat them, but be careful as the hit detection isn't the best and it's easy to take damage here, even when jumping on enemies yourself. Enemies come in the form of other insects like grasshoppers that jump all over the place, dung beetles that fling shit at you, and bees that dive bomb you out of nowhere. Thankfully, you can take a few hits before you die, and you will find extra lives, health, and even power-ups like invincibility in the levels that will help you out. There's also gems you can collect, and yep, 100 gets you an extra life. You'll also need to track down keys and switches to open doors or move walkways to let you get to where you need to go. Annoyingly, there is no map, which really would have helped a lot here. You do get checkpoints, but these are few and far between, and you can easily lose 10 minutes or so of progress, which in a game like this is a hell of a lot more than it sounds. I quite like the graphics here, they're all pre-rendered, and Bug has the usual annoying personality of pretty much every character in a game like this from this time, but he looks fine and the levels all look decent enough. The main problems here are the perspective, as you need to be lined up perfectly with the pathways if you want to turn. It's fine if you've got nowhere else to go, but if you come to an intersection with enemies or obstacles, timing your turns is very difficult. Also, Bug has no shadow, and there's a lot of precise jumping required here. For the most part, it's actually not too bad, but a shadow on you and enemies would really help with perspective, as it is hard to tell exactly where you or enemies or platforms actually are. Sometimes they're right on you, and sometimes they're actually quite far away. But still, I do kind of enjoy this game, and I would recommend giving it a go. It also has a sequel, which I do own, but I haven't played that one yet. When the N64 was launched in 1996, Mario was there to greet everyone for his first time in proper 3D. And this is my original copy of the game that I'm playing on the N64 we got when it was first released. Good times. The story here is exactly the same, as Bowser kidnaps Peach for the 100th time. I think she kinda likes it, you know. So Mario goes back to the Mushroom Kingdom after getting a letter about her giving him some cake, and you've got to go get her back. This time round you have to explore a huge 3D world with Peach's castle acting as a hub. Within it there's paintings you can jump into, which are your levels. Each level has a bunch of power stars you need to collect by completing certain objectives within those levels. You need the stars to open even more doors inside the castle, and eventually you'll fight Bowser himself. Again, I'm sure most of you already know how this goes. But the move to 3D here is just done so well, and the amount Mario can still do is genuinely impressive. For starters, Mario has a ton of moves at his disposal. You can of course run and jump as normal, but you also have a triple jump you can do, with each one getting a little bit higher. You've got a punch kick combo, which is your main attack, as well as being able to jump on enemies' heads. You can also swim, fly, pick things up, wall jump and more. It really is impressive still, and the controls are actually very responsive, letting you do all this stuff with relative ease. It's also pretty intuitive as well. The levels themselves are a bit of a mixed bag for me. There is a huge variety, from the intro Bob-omb battlefield where you're exploring a large grassy land filled with Bob-ombs, to the ghost house which is packed with secrets. You've got fire levels, ice levels, deserts, underground caverns. The variety is really good, but there are some levels that are all quite annoying. For me, there's Tick-Tock Clock, where you're inside a clock, which is quite annoying, along with Rainbow Ride and Wet Dry World, which all have some very tough platforming, and Wet Dry World in particular forces you to raise and lower water levels to get around, which is something that has never been fun in any game ever. But the majority of them are still good fun. The tasks you get are varied, from just exploring till you find a star, to beating a boss, collecting coins, solving a puzzle. There's plenty to do, and the levels themselves often change slightly depending on the star you're getting. You are given a hint at the start of each level about how you get that star, but a lot of them are incredibly hard to get. As well as that, the castle itself has a bunch of hidden stars to find, and there's 120 in total. Get them all and there's a surprise waiting for you. Quite a disappointing surprise, but hey, it's kind of fun. Overall though, the move to 3D here was excellent, and this is another game that still holds up really well today. It does show some signs of age, like with the camera which moves in increments, not letting you put it exactly where you want it, and some crappy levels, but overall there really isn't too much to complain about here. It's also the game where we got Mario's now iconic voice, so that's got to count for something. There's so much to do here that this is a game that you can easily spend weeks playing and finding more and more as you do, and I definitely recommend that you do this if you can. Banjo-Kazooie is one of the best loved games on the N64, and it's easy to see why. Made by Rare back when they weren't slaves to the machine, it's a 3D platform game similar to Mario 64, where you take control of the titular bear Banjo and his Breegull buddy Kazooie, who have to rescue Banjo's sister Tootie, who's been kidnapped by the evil rhyming witch grunt Hilda. You got all that? There are 9 vastly different worlds to explore, each containing 10 jiggies which you need to open the next level, and each level has 100 musical notes which are used to open new areas in the game's hub world. Just about everything in the game is spot on, the graphics are great, the music is spectacular, and it'll get stuck in your head for days. The controls are simple, even with the large moveset that you have, and even the humour in the game stands up. The characters are all just very likeable. This is one of those games where finding every hidden item and collectible is as much fun as the main game. The game and its sequel were remastered for the Xbox 360 and Xbox One and show everything in glorious HD, and they even sort out the frame rate issues that crop up in the N64 versions. But no matter what platform you play this game on, you're going to have a good time. Banjo-Tooie is the gigantic sequel to Banjo-Kazooie, released for the N64 and later the Xbox 360 and Xbox One in glorious HD. The graphics in the game have had a big update and they look great, and the sound, music and humour is still brilliant. Gameplay is largely the same as the first game, with another 9 worlds each containing 100 notes and 10 jiggies to be tackled. There's a few differences here though. This time the shaman, Mumbo Jumbo, is a playable character, although you only get to use him for a couple of minutes per level. It would have been nice to see him have a bit more to do. There's also loads of new moves as well as the ones from the original game, including first-person shooter sections, which are a fun change. The game world has grown immensely and in my opinion not necessarily for the better. It's easy to get lost here, especially in the hub world, and some levels start to feel like a bit of a chore to complete. There's also a multiplayer mode here too, but this feels very tacked on and you'll probably never really bother with it. Overall it is still a great game, but I think I would recommend the first one over this one. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts for the Xbox 360 is a 3D adventure game, but unlike the first two, has an emphasis on creating and driving vehicles to help you collect your jiggies. Again, like the originals, you travel through various worlds completing tasks to get a jiggy or musical notes. Get enough of these and you can make it to the next level and eventually take on Grunty, where you battle your custom cars. The game looks fantastic with a really nice art style and a beautiful world. Gameplay wise, it's a very good game. It does have some issues though, and not just the fact that it's not a traditional Banjo game. Firstly, the tasks to get jiggies are often quite dull, with you just needing to get from A to B within a time limit. There are some exceptions of course, but the fact that the missions usually only last a couple of minutes anyway means that you're usually looking at the loading screen more than playing them, and yes, there are a lot of loading screens here. The vehicle building is also a bit tedious and often confusing, meaning that unless you spend hours learning it, you'll end up just using the pre-made basic vehicles, and when this is one of the main focuses of the game, that's not ideal. However, there is a lot of fun to be had with the game. And you can't talk about Banjo-Kazooie and not mention Yooka Laylee, can you? It's the spiritual sequel to the game, made by a lot of the same developers that made Banjo, which means it should be great, but I'm not so sure. You play as Yooka and Laylee, a chameleon bat combo that basically works exactly the same as Banjo. In fact, the game really doesn't shy away from being the spiritual sequel that it is. They pretty much have the same moveset, as well as a fair few things of their own, like being able to turn invisible, being able to eat certain things to give different properties, like fire or ice. Gameplay is basically the same here. You have a large hub world belonging to the evil capital B, who is being a bastard, so you need to take him down. Basically, he's just grunty. You explore the needlessly large HQ where you'll find entrances to the various levels of the game. Your goal is to complete the tasks inside, like puzzles, minigames, combat situations, or sometimes just finding the pages that you need to open the new worlds and eventually fight Capital B. And on paper, this is all great, but for me, there's just something about this game that doesn't sit right. Firstly, there's the controls. While good, they feel way too floaty and imprecise, making a lot of the platforming sections tricky. Then there's the levels themselves, which I think is really my main complaint. They're just way too big. Each level has a whopping 25 pages to find, and while you don't need to get all of them, you'll need a fair chunk, and I found that I just had no idea where the hell I needed to go or what I needed to do on pretty much every level. They are massive and hard to navigate, with little to no guidance of telling you which way to go for anything. And while I do know that that is kind of the point in games like this, they're all about exploring, these levels are just huge and they've got areas that you can run around that have literally nothing to do in them, that just seem to be massive for the sake of being massive. I found it all confusing and would regularly run around in circles not knowing where to go. That's not to say it's bad though, as I definitely did have some fun here. When you do get into your stride, or when you eventually find a minigame or character to talk to find a task, it is great fun, and it has a fantastic sense of humour. It's just that I found that this was less frequent than me being annoyed with the game. Even the hub world is stupidly massive. Now, to be fair, I did complete this game over a year ago, and this is the first time I'm coming back to it just to record this footage, so this didn't help. But I did want to show footage from each of the levels, but genuinely could not find my way around the hub to get most of them. Surely that's not a good sign. I can understand the main levels being confusing, but not the hub world. You don't have any sort of map, so even with the arrows that are in the levels, there's not really much help at all. It's a shame, as the game looks fantastic and I love the graphics here. It's really what you'd expect from a next-gen Banjo game. Unfortunately for me, the levels are just too big and open and boring, and the controls are a little sloppy. I'm pretty sure a lot of people do really like this one, but I'm not one of them. But, you know, take everything I've said with a pinch of salt and give it a go if you think it looks fun. Here is Kao the Kangaroo for the Sega Dreamcast. The story here is simple. You are Kao and your family's been kidnapped by a hunter, so you set off to get them back. Of course, this involves navigating a load of quite large 3D levels, packed with perilous platforms, dangerous enemies, and a load of bottomless pits for you to avoid. For the most part, levels are just a case of getting from A to B, and the ones here are actually very linear, playing more like a Crash Bandicoot game, where you essentially have a path to follow, but I don't mind that at all. There's plenty of enemies on all the levels here, but being a kangaroo, you've got your trusty boxing gloves and can punch enemies to death. You also have a tail whip that isn't quite as effective. Although having said that, the punching isn't all that great either, and you'll likely find that you take a load of damage when you're trying to attack, and I found that I just avoided fighting as much as possible. And the hit detection is also a problem when it comes to platforming, as hazards and obstacles will often hurt you when you're miles away from them. But still, the game is perfectly playable, and is actually quite enjoyable, which isn't really something you say much about games from Titus. The controls are solid enough, and getting around the levels is fun. You don't control the camera, it just sort of does its own thing, which can actually be a pain when it swings around and makes the controls go backwards. There's even sections when you're running towards the camera, and these are really bad, as the controls are just backwards by default, and it is totally unnatural. Thankfully, there aren't many of these bits. You can punch scenery to open hidden areas to collect coins and power-ups that give you extra health, lives, and a few stronger attacks, but these attacks can only be used a couple of times. Something that I'm really not a fan of is the checkpoint system, which in theory is kind of interesting, but for me wasn't useful. You find flags which you can basically plant wherever you like, then when you die you go back to that flag. Now, I know this is actually kind of handy if you do it properly, but the trouble is you never know how long a level is, so you don't know if you're using it right at the start of the level, or in the middle, or right near the end. So I ended up rarely using them at all, and also most of the time I just totally forgot because it was so unnatural to place your own checkpoints. Done a bit better though, this could have been a cool mechanic. Graphically, the game is fine. I think I've said before that I'm a big fan of how Dreamcast games look, and this one is very Dreamcast. It's bright and colourful and has nice smooth animation, and it runs at a solid frame rate. Overall, I'd say that this is just about an above average game. It's definitely not bad, in fact I'd say it's quite fun. It's got its issues, almost all of which were rectified in the sequel, which is actually a really fun game, and you can find out all about that in my A to Z of PS2 Hidden Gems video. So yeah, check this one out as well. Sticking with the Dreamcast, here is Super Magnetic Neo, which was suggested by Tellboy2011, so thanks for your suggestion. In this 3D platformer, the evil Pinky Gang have taken over an amusement park that you're part of and have filled it with all sorts of evil robots and hazards. Thankfully, Neo happens to have magnetic abilities which he can use to navigate the various locations of the park, which include prehistoric lands, futuristic ones, western levels, jungles and so on, to defeat the robots and get the park back. As a magnetic boy, Neo has different abilities than your usual 3D platform heroes. You can still run and jump, but to interact with most of what you need to interact with and to defeat enemies, you'll need to use your magnet powers. You have the both plus and minus polarities represented here with different colours, either pink or blue. Depending on what you do, you'll need to use these. Basic magnet rules apply. Opposites attract, and the same ones repel. So if you're on a platform that is blue, you can use your blue magnet thingy to repel yourself and boost yourself high into the air. Or if you use the pink one, you'll magnet yourself to the platform and be stuck to it. You'll need to use this everywhere to hang on ledges or moving platforms to get around the levels. And though it took my tiny brain way longer than it probably should have done to get used to it, when you do, it's good fun to move around. You can also use your powers against enemies as well. They are often blue or red. Use the opposite colour to bring them to you, at which point they're put in a box that you get from somewhere and you can throw them to their death. Or you can throw them into other enemies or even parts of the scenery to interact with or knock over walls or switches or things like that are out of the way. It's really fun. If it's an enemy that you can't magnetise, normally you can just jump on them to kill them. Like Kao the Kangaroo, this is another very linear game and you just have to follow one path, but it's definitely not easy. You can only take one hit before you die here, and there's plenty of things out to kill you, including the obligatory bottomless pits. It actually did take me quite a few tries to get past even some of the early levels. But that was always down to me, as the controls are smooth and responsive. You can collect coins for extra lives, and there's a few bonus stages too where you get a few rewards. Graphically, I love how it looks, and I'm a sucker for bright cartoony games, and this one is great. Neo isn't an annoying character, as he doesn't really talk or anything like that during the game, and I like that. There's also some really cool looking bosses, which I only fought 2 of so far, but they were fun to figure out. This is definitely a game that I'll be going back to, as I want to get better at putting together various magnet combos to get around the levels, and I really want to see what some of the later levels look like. So, thank you for the suggestion on this one. It's a great game, and one that I would definitely recommend. Back to the N64 now for Rocket, Robot on Wheels. In terms of story, this is pretty similar to Super Magnetic Neo. You are Rocket, who is in fact a robot on wheels, and you're going around various circus themed levels where you have to complete tasks in order to earn tokens and cogs, which your friends around the park can then use to fix new rides and areas, letting the park open back up. The game has plenty of early 3D platform game tropes, which I'm actually a pretty big fan of. Exploring large levels where you'll need to do things like fight enemies, do precarious platforming and meet crazy characters that give you jobs to do, like finding items, racing them or other things. There's 12 tickets hidden on each level, and as you'd expect, once you have a certain number of them, new levels will become available, so you can go between the levels without the need to get every single one on every single stage. Rocket himself controls a hell of a lot better than I expected, and in fact the whole game plays a lot better than I expected. He moves at a good pace and is fast. You've got no arms, so most of what you do is done with your tractor beam thing attached to your head. You'll use it to pick up most of the things you find in levels, which you can then carry around with you, or throw them around the place if you want to cause some carnage. A lot of the puzzles are physics based and have some sort of magnet element to them. You will get extra abilities as you play as well, letting you do more with what you find. There's also vehicles that you can find around the levels which you'll need to use to get around even faster and take on some of the other characters in the game to get those valuable tickets. Now, I only had time to play this for about 2 hours, so I actually haven't managed to get past the first world just yet, but there is a huge emphasis on puzzles and exploring, and there's little to no hand-holding other than the vague hints in the levels, but unlike Yooka Laylee, it's actually done well here and the levels aren't too big, so it's not too much of a trouble. It looks good for an N64 game. I am playing it on real hardware, hence the quality of the footage, but it is fairly solid and it's got a good frame rate and is smooth enough. I do wish I could find a better solution for recording my real N64 though that doesn't cost hundreds of pounds, so if you know a good way of doing it, just let me know. At the moment I've just got one of those cheap converters. But in the meantime, give this game a try. It's really good fun and one that doesn't get talked about all that much. Another one that doesn't get talked about a lot for the N64 is Starshot Space Circus Fever. Here you play as Starshot, who is a juggler for a struggling space circus. At the start of the game you visit a beach planet when your circus is trying to make some money, but your rival, Virtual Circus, is already there and has blown up a load of your attractions. So as Starshot you've got to explore various planets where Virtual Circus are located, and you need to blow their stuff up in retaliation, so your circus can be the best one around. It's a daft plot, but it's fine. Unlike most 3D platform games, this one doesn't really have a heavy emphasis on collecting shit. Instead, you've got objectives in each level that you'll need to complete to move on. But boy, this is much easier said than done. The game does not give you much direction at all, and you can spend hours wandering around locations not knowing what the hell you're meant to be doing. When you do eventually trigger something though, it does feel quite rewarding. Starshot can run and jump, and there's 3 things that you will want to collect in the levels. There's blue things, which are your ammo. Starshot can shoot energy blasts at enemies, which you can also control if you hold down the B button, but you need ammo. Thankfully, the blue things always reappear after a few seconds, so you're never left without for too long. There's also yellow blobs. These are fuel for your rocket dog companion, and you can use him whenever you like to grab onto and fly around. You can fly as long as you have fuel, but it doesn't last very long, and it's also pretty hard to control. Also, there's red blobs. These are your fuel for your main spaceship, and you'll need to collect a certain amount of these to be able to fly to new planets. But your main focus on the levels is to explore and complete your various objectives. Now, this is a game that I've owned for years, and one that I've never managed to finish. Coming back to it now, I can remember it why. Firstly, the graphics are incredibly blurry, even for an N64 game, and make it really hard to make out what the hell is going on a lot of the time. The frame rate isn't great, and moving around is very jerky. Of course, on top of this, the camera just kinda sucks, and is often exactly where you don't want it to be. You can control it, but not very well. There's plenty of narrow platforms and loads of instant death areas, and avoiding these is very tough. Thankfully, you do get infinite lives. It's a game that I really wish I could enjoy more than I do. There is a PC version available on Steam that I am actually quite tempted to get, as I think with the cleaned up graphics and a better frame rate this could be good fun. But still, the confusing levels, lack of direction and annoying camera make this one that is pretty hard to recommend. Jinx on the PS1 is a game that came out very late in the life of the system after the PS2 was already out and doing well, and was also only released in Europe for some reason. But you know what? It's pretty good. You are Jinx, a magician who ended up being a jester as you are kinda shit. One day though, you wake up to find that your world has literally gone mad, so you've got to set out to stop everyone from fighting amongst each other, and the crazy creatures that have appeared need to be stopped. Oh, and there's a pirate leader to be dealt with as well. You have to 3D platform your way through a bunch of worlds, all of which have a sort of cartoony medieval theme to them, fighting enemies, collecting keys, hunting for buttons and switches that will open new areas for you to eventually reach the boss and give him a good kicking. The levels are all surprisingly large here and can easily take up to half an hour to beat. There's always loads to do in them, and you'll be navigating plenty of platform sections as well as solving simple puzzles, usually ones that involve pushing blocks or things like that. There's loads of enemies to fight as well, but you're pretty handy with your magic staff, so you can give most bad guys a good whacking. There's also a few bosses to fight, and these are good fun. Something I really like about Jinx is how well they mix up the levels. There's plenty to do in them, with lots of hidden areas, and you're constantly switching from platforming to puzzles to fighting, and you're never stuck doing the same thing for too long, which means it never gets boring. And the levels go all over the place as well. You'll find yourself on platforms high above castles, and then a minute later you're down in the dungeons. It's great. The controls are smooth and responsive and never overly complicated. You can control the camera with the shoulder buttons, and even though it's basic, I found that it was never really an issue to see where I needed to go, and you've got a shadow to help with your jumping. The graphics are great for the system with some cool lighting effects and minimal texture warping. While I don't think that this game would have sold particularly well even if it came out earlier in the system's life, I do think that it's a solid entry for the system and one that I'd never even heard of until it was recommended to me by Royal Guardian, so thank you for telling me about it. Definitely one that I would recommend though if you like 3D platform games. Forty Winks is a charming 3D platform game where you play as either Rough or Tumble, who I hope have reported their parents to child services, because that's not okay. You choose which one to play as at the start of the game, though there's not really any difference between them that I could really tell. The story here is that the Winks, with an I, protect kids from nightmares, and some evil bastard has decided to kidnap them all. So kids' dreams are getting turned into nightmares, and you have to go into the dream world to defeat the monsters that have taken the Winks and rescue them. Your adventure takes you through some pretty cool, quite large levels, from Halloween-themed places, space, deserts, underseas, and even prehistoric ones. Each world is divided up into different levels, and each of which have a certain number of Winks that you'll need to find. These are often hidden in hard-to-reach places, being behind a big door, though sometimes you will also need to fight a boss or big enemy to get them back. Levels are packed with things to collect. There's Z's, which are your health, coins that give you extra lives, and more importantly, cogs. You need these to open the doors in the levels. The doors will always tell you how many cogs you need, and often there's exactly the right amount of cogs on each level. This can be kind of annoying, as if you miss just one of them, then you do have to do a lot of backtracking, but quite often the levels are reasonably linear, or not too crazy large, that you'll tend to collect them all on the way anyway. There's plenty of enemies all over the place as well, and what's nice is that each level has its own enemies. I always appreciate this. Yeah, sometimes they are just reskins, and often enemies do little more than just wander towards you and hope they hit you before you hit them, but it is nice to have some variety. You do have a few attacks, of course. You've got a candle that you can whack enemies with. This does a decent enough job, and you have the obligatory 3D platformer butt drop, but this is mainly used for switches, and you can also use a projectile, though you'll need to collect power-ups to be able to do that. What's cool here though is that each level there's little boxes, and you can jump in these boxes and then you're transformed into something new, like a ninja, a caveman, space ranger and more. This is where you get most of your powers, letting you do things like smashing walls, better attacks, moving faster and jumping higher. You'll need to use these forms throughout the levels to get everything that you need. You can still take damage while you're like this, and they only last a certain amount of time, but you can collect icons in the levels that top up your timer. These are always really fun to use. The variety in the levels is very good too, and while some of them can seem to drag, there are usually a handful of Winks on each stage, so you won't be stuck on any of them for too long. Also, your house acts as the hub world, and here you get little side missions like races and so on to complete, where you can get extra lives and things like that. The graphics here are really cool with a good cartoony style. This is about as close to an N64 platform game as you can get on the system if you ask me, and of course it was also semi-recently released on the N64, as that version was originally cancelled until a Kickstarter got it properly released. But you can see the influences from the N64 games, especially in the controls, which make great use of the DualShock analog sticks. They are a little bit slippery, but overall the game is really fun to play and the controls weren't really a problem. Being able to control the camera of the other analog stick is spot on, and it really helps the experience. I really had a blast playing this, and while I haven't quite finished it yet, I'm on the third world, it is definitely one of the best 3D platform games I've played for the system, and I can imagine one that a lot of people have a lot of fond memories with, and I can see why. This one is highly recommended. It's a lot of fun, and that's what I like. Here is 102 Dalmatians. This is another 3D platform game based on the straight-to-DVD movie, sort of. In the game you play as a couple of puppies, and you have to set out across London where other 100 puppies have been dognapped and need rescuing. Of course, that evil Cruella de Vil is behind it all, so you'll need to bite her ankles while you're at it. Your adventure will take you all over London, from some nice parks to Big Ben, a toy shop for some reason, maybe it's meant to be Harrods, and a few other landmarks like Piccadilly. Each level is fairly decent in size and has about 6 or so dogs hidden in it that you need to find. The dogs are all in boxes that are seemingly randomly placed throughout the levels. You have to find them and smash the box open to rescue them, and it's actually pretty well done and quite fun to play. The levels themselves, as mentioned, are a good size, but they're never too big or complex, usually with 5 or 6 connected sections, making it easy to get around. As well as the puppies to rescue, there's also 100 bones on every level. Getting these gives you an extra life, and you can actually find extra lives in the levels as well. And on top of this, by completing certain tasks within the level, some of which are told to you by other characters, and some you have to discover for yourself, by interacting with objects on the level, you'll win stickers, which you can then muck about with in a sticker book. It doesn't really add much to the game, but I do really like how it's all set up, and gives you a reason to explore every inch of the levels. Of course, there's enemies here as well. These are in the form of dog catchers, who just need to be avoided as they can't be defeated, as well as a series of deadly toys that for some reason want nothing more than to kill dogs. But you can fight back. You can bark, which does a decent job of killing stuff for some reason, but hey, it's a game, who cares? Or you have a roll attack, which gives you a little speed boost and is also how you smash boxes. You don't have to find every dog on every level before moving on to the next one, which is nice. If you find the exit on a stage you're on, you can always go through it and start the next level. Then at any point you can exit the stage you're on to go back to a previous one and collect anything you might have missed, and that's always a nice addition. The graphics here are pretty good. They're very clear and have a fair bit of detail, though this does come at the expense of a fair bit of texture warping and quite a lot of pop-up. And I also had times where the clipping was a bit off, and I couldn't tell if something was actually where it looked like it was, or if it was below me or behind me, but it was never that much of an issue. Also, and quite surprisingly, the camera is pretty decent here. You can't use the analog sticks unfortunately, so you have to use the shoulder buttons to move it around, but it is smooth and it doesn't get stuck too often. I never really had a hard time controlling it. I mean, an analog option would have been much better, but beggars can't be choosers. The controls themselves are also decent. The game is responsive and it's easy to do everything you need to do here. No complaints there. Now, this is clearly a game aimed at a younger audience, but I did still have a fair bit of fun with it. The Collectathon gameplay is well done and the graphics are good, and the level design means it was actually one that I wanted to keep playing. Believe it or not, I would actually recommend giving this a go if you're a fan of 3D platform games and you've already finished 40 Winks. Sonic didn't go 3D until 1998 when Sonic Adventure was released on the Sega Dreamcast to much excitement. In his adventure, Sonic has to stop Eggman, who is up to his usual tricks of capturing animals and trying to steal the Chaos Emeralds to get unlimited power. This time round, you have an open world hub situation where you explore a few environments and do certain tasks that open up the actual levels, or action stages as the game calls them. Most of the time, your goal of these is just to get to the end of the stage, and you'll occasionally fight a boss. Some of these levels are very linear and basic and just have one path for you to follow, but others do offer more exploration. You also have a few other characters here that you can play as, including Tails, Knuckles, Amy, Big the Cat and the robot E102. The gameplay for each of these characters is slightly different, and they have a few stages of their own as well as sharing a few of the other levels, so they do have a few in common. Knuckles, for example, has stages where you have to go on treasure hunts and find crystals. When you're close to them, you'll get an indicator helping you dig them out of the ground or smash a box that contains them, or something along those lines. Amy has a giant hammer that she uses as a weapon, and most of her levels are more combat focused. Then there's Big the Cat, who's trying to find his friend Froggy, a frog. And to do that, you have to go fishing, and I still can't believe someone thought these were a good idea. The thing is, no matter who you're playing as, the game just doesn't really feel all that great to play, especially not for how it should do. The whole thing is just so twitchy and spastic and full to the ballsack with glitches. Oh, and by the way, I'm playing the updated Xbox 360 version here, which is supposed to be a better experience. Now, I will say that this is something of a guilty pleasure for me, but I wouldn't really say it's a very good game, even though I know there's people out there that absolutely love this game, but those people are wrong. It's not a terrible game, it's just fine. First off though, the animation, which is just awkward at the best of times, is quite bad. No matter who you are, they just look really weird doing most things. Now, it does look kind of fine if you're just running in a straight line, but as soon as you try and move, everything just looks twitchy and the game freaks out. And this is perfectly translated over to the controls, which are just twitchy and awkward. There's levels where you're going really fast, and these can feel great for a few seconds, as long as you're just going straight. As soon as you have to turn a corner or even just move to the side a little, strange things will happen, like just coming to a dead stop, jerking awkwardly against the sides of levels, or most often than not, just falling through the floor completely for no reason at all and losing a life. It really just feels like the game isn't finished. Also, the cutscenes here are laughable, with some of the worst voice acting I've heard, terrible animation that often starts and finishes too early, and even times where the camera is positioned so the characters aren't even on screen. Considering this was Sega's big mascot at the time, it just looks very amateurish. Of course, on top of that, the camera kinda sucks. The Dreamcast only had one analog stick, so you use the L and R shoulder buttons to rotate the camera left and right, and you've got no control over zooming in or out, and at times it just refuses to move completely anyway. Most of my deaths came from falling off of things, or most often through things I wasn't meant to be able to, and that was mainly down to the camera most often than not. But yeah, I know I've shot on this game quite a lot, but I don't know if I'd necessarily it's a bad game. Well, maybe I would. It's one of those games that a lot of people have nostalgia for, but when you go back to it and play it nowadays, you really see how many glitches and gameplay problems it has. And when you compare it to even a number of PS1 and N64 games, other than the graphics, which are actually pretty damn good, the gameplay just doesn't even really match up to them. Mario 64 is still a much better game than this, deal with it. But I was always compelled to come back to it, and have actually nearly 100%ed the game, so it must be doing something right? But yeah, I'm sure people will tell me I'm wrong, and that's fine. You can imagine my excitement when Bubsy 3D was released for the PS1 in 1996, the same year as Mario 64. Bubsy is 3D in Forbidden Planet, to give it its full title, is a 3D platform game where Bubsy is kidnapped by the evil Woolies and taken to their home planet in space. Sadly, rather than discovering he can't survive in their atmosphere and dying a painful death, Bubsy instead escapes and has to find parts of a rocket so he can fly home. You do this by exploring some very ugly 3D worlds, collecting atoms and hunting down the rocket bits that are hidden on the levels. As you can imagine, it's not done well. To start with, the game just looks atrocious. I'm not entirely sure what the hell most of this is meant to be. Levels are an ugly mess of single coloured polygons with barely any textures or detail to any of them. Bubsy himself doesn't look too terrible, to be honest, but the enemies are just a mess of polygons that often don't make sense, even up close, and they've got barely any animation. Everything just looks so unfinished. And then there's the controls, and man are they bad, but like really bad. There's no analog control here, it's all done with tank controls, but Bubsy has the turning circle of a U-boat, so if you do want to turn, most of the time, you've got to stop in one place, rotate, and then just move forward again. It makes basically doing anything a real chore. Collecting items is a mission in itself, and because of this, coupled with some bad collision detection, it means that you usually just walk past items, or sometimes even just go through them. This also applies to actual platforms. It's very easy to fall off them, and of course lining yourself up with them in the first place isn't easy. You do have a strafe button, which can help, but you have to be standing still to strafe, so you can't circle around things. The look of the levels also makes it really hard to know what the hell you're doing and where the hell you are. You've got no control of the camera, and everything just looks the same with the strange patterns everywhere, and I'd often have no idea where I was or where I needed to go. Thankfully, here you can take more than one hit before you die, which is good, as jumping on enemies to kill them seems to be a lottery of whether you take damage or they do. It's so inconsistent. And don't get me started on the bosses. I got to the first two of the bosses and I fought them both and had a miserable time. And I'm still not entirely sure what I did to beat either of them. I do know that I died a hell of a lot though. Oh, and just to make things more annoying, you can't touch water at all. Like, even if your little toe touches it, it's an instant death. Except later on there's swimming levels where you're just swimming in the water. Make your mind up. And of course, because of the move to CD based games, they were able to give Bubsy a ton of voice samples, and it seems like they went out of their way to make him as annoying and obnoxious as possible. He has the most annoying voice of any video game character I can think of, and on top of that, nothing he says is clever or funny. It really is like they wanted to make a really bad game. And if that was the case, then mission accomplished. I genuinely hate this game, and I think it's the worst game I've played on the PS1, and definitely one of the worst I've ever played, and that's for real. This is a rare case of a game actually being as bad as people says it is. So yeah, make sure you give it a go. Let's have a platform game now with Evil Twin Cyprian's Chronicles from Ubisoft. Here you play as an orphan called Cyprian, and wouldn't you know it, your favourite teddy bear has been captured by some dark magical tentacles from another world, so you have to go get it back.
Now actually the story is quite a lot darker than that, dealing with the death of Cyprian's parents and the stories of other kids in the orphanage being taken by tentacles, but you are best off seeing it played out in the game rather than me badly relaying it to you. So you end up in a crazy world that's filled with all sorts of strange locations and inhabitants that you'll need to explore and fight in order to save your teddy, as well as some other kids from the orphanage. This is all done in classic 3D platform style and is a relatively early game for the PS2, which does show, but it's still a good time. After battling through a quite lengthy tutorial section where you're taught how to run, jump, etc., you are plonked into a hub world where you discover that a great zippette, which is needed to rescue people and save the land, has been separated into 4 pieces, and each one sent to a different part of the world. So you have to navigate a number of tricky platforming sections, battle enemies and solve puzzles in order to get them all back. The game is actually quite linear despite its hub world and look. You have to visit each area in turn where you'll meet a ton of strange characters who will ask you to do things for them like kill enemies, collect items, etc. and doing this will usually reward you with a new item for yourself that you can use elsewhere in the world to open up a new area. I wouldn't really say this is a Metroidvania style game, as you don't really need to backtrack all that often other than to return to the characters that gave you the missions. There are a good number of enemies here, but the game never overwhelms you with them. You can fight them in a few ways. You've got a slingshot, like any good orphan does. This has unlimited ammo and is actually pretty handy against most enemies. It's slow to fire but has an auto aim, or you can go into first person mode to manually aim. You'll also need to use this to hit certain switches and things like that. You do get different ammo types and other uses out of it as well, like needing to fire paper airplanes, which you can then guide. You also have a jump attack, which, to be honest, I hate using. You jump in the air and press square to do a dive bomb thing, but it attacks at an angle and is really slippery. It's hard to hit enemies with it, and if you're anywhere near an edge, you will almost always slide off. I rarely bothered using this after a while. On top of this though, you can also collect items that build a power meter. This lets you transform into a super version of yourself, and what's cool is you can do it no matter how much power is in the meter. But as long as there is power in there, you have access to some more abilities. Firstly, you move faster and jump higher, but there's also a lightning attack which you have, which is really powerful, as well as a fireball attack. But using these drains your power bar quicker, so you need to be careful where and when you use them all. Thankfully, these icons that increase your power bar do reappear fairly often, so it's easy enough to come back to them. As mentioned, there's a few platforming sections, and I do have to say that these can be a pain in the ass, mainly thanks to the controls, which are quite sloppy and unresponsive. And they do make some of the sections a pain to play through, and there's quite a few times where I died where I really don't think I should have done. There's a delay in pressing the button and actually doing something, which is never good in a game. Though I did find I had to try again and again. I think that's down to the overall tone of the game, which is exactly my style. The characters, the world and everything just look great, and it's got a real Tim Burton or American McGee feel to it. The world is surreal and sinister, and you never know really which characters you should be trusting and which ones are going to stab you in the back. The amount of subtle imagery here is great as well. It's kind of like Silent Hill vibes meets Coraline, in the way that everything is a blend of subconscious thoughts and problems but brought to life. This is what really made me keep playing the game, and rescuing all the kids and saving the imaginary land was always intriguing. This is the sort of game that really should get a remaster. The visual style really is incredible, and with some polish to the controls, this could be a fantastic game. As it is though, it is still a good game, and you should check it out. If 3D platform games are more your thing, then you might want to check out Brave, the Search for Spirit Dancer. Here you take control of the generically named Brave, a Native American who rescues his lady friend from a particularly hench bear and then goes on a quest to become a warrior by taking on some traditions of his tribe. This will see you go through a variety of locations, from jungles and deserts to frozen tundras and of course forests. You're always given a few objectives in all of these places, and you'll need to explore every inch of them to complete your objectives, like killing certain enemies, finding certain items, you know, the usual 3D platform things. But also, you do have some pretty cool things like tracking animals, which you learn to do early on and lets you find hidden footprints around the levels. These often lead to new items or enemies that you need to track down. You can also learn to use nature in helping you out, becoming friendly with certain animals and learning their calls. Doing this lets you call birds to help you by dropping items from trees or even taking you to places, or just revealing hidden items.
You'll also find cave paintings hidden around the environment. These are vital to progress, as using them shows you techniques used by your ancestors that lived in the area and how they survived. So some paintings will teach you how to use fire, or how to track, or how to craft items like axes, which you can use as a weapon, or to climb ice caps. It's all pretty cool. If you ever get stuck, you can use your spirit stone that was given to you by your grandfather. He'll give you some advice about what you should be doing. I like this, and it never tells you exactly where to go or what to do, but gives enough of a hint to point you in the right direction. There are of course a ton of enemies all over the place as well, and these are all different depending on where you are. So in the desert you'll get bugs, in the forest you'll get evil birds and wolves, and you even get to fight skeletons and other things that have come to life to make your life a misery. Thankfully, controlling Brave is very responsive, and using all of the abilities you get is easy. The combat is simple enough with just one attack button, but you're fast and nimble, and it really does help make the game enjoyable to play. Graphically, it's got a nice cartoony style, but I do have to say that I'm not a big fan of the character designs. They look kind of strange and goofy, but it's definitely not a bad looking game and has some really cool designs in the locations. It's not a particularly difficult game, and other than a few times where I got stuck with where to go, I didn't have much trouble at all, but it really did make me want to carry on playing. I've heard a lot of people give this game a lot of crap, but honestly I don't really know why. I think where it's cool to shit on things on the internet, this game gets a bit of a bad rap, though it's actually a very solid platform game. Sure, it is a little bit generic, but it does actually have some really cool ideas of its own. I recommend giving this a go for yourself to see if you enjoy it as much as I did.
Brave long ago, a terrible creature ravaged our...
And finally for today, here is Voodoo Vince for the original Xbox, another console I don't talk about nearly enough. Vince is a voodoo doll, and he is brought to life after his owner's voodoo shop is broken into and robbed by a rival voodoo bloke and his minions. Get ready for me to see voodoo a lot. Vince is one of the few things not taken, and happens to be the third best voodoo doll that the shop owner has, so he's got to track down the thieves and get back all the stuff before they can use it to do evil black magic. You'll get to explore a really cool world here that all interconnects after a while, and I really love the whole look of the game. It's another one that could have been made by Tim Burton with crazy characters and a spooky but kind of family friendly aesthetic. You'll explore towns, graveyards, shops, caves and more as you collect juju beads, magic flasks and voodoo powers. There's the usual running and jumping to be done. I mean, it's a 3D platform game, so how many times can I repeat myself? But being a voodoo doll, you've got a few cool things you can do. There's a load of enemies all over the place, and you can fight with your fists, which works well. They'll drop the juju beads when you kill them, and you can use these to fill your magic meter. When it's full, you'll glow blue, and you can pull both shoulder buttons at the same time to do a voodoo attack. These are great and come in a few varieties, and basically they all end up with you getting torn apart in ever increasingly violent ways. But this of course hurts your enemies and not really you, and they will die. You can take out large groups of enemies with these moves. It's great, but it doesn't mean you're invincible, and they can still kill you, but you know, video game logic, deal with it. You might also need to hurt yourself to complete puzzles, like being set on fire to light torches, or being shredded to get through small gaps and things like that. It's really cool and inventive, and I really like seeing all the different things that happen. There is a lot of puzzling to do here as well. Well, maybe not puzzling, more exploring to find an item that you need, normally to get access to a new area or to do some damage to yourself so you can get somewhere else or kill someone. The game looks great with some really smooth graphics and animation and a great frame rate. There's a fantastic sense of humour here as well, and Vince isn't annoying, and he talks just about enough smack and usually lets the violence do the talking instead. It's also got a really cool jazz soundtrack, and I genuinely love jazz. This is a really fun game, and it's actually one of the main reasons I wanted an original Xbox. Thankfully, it turned out to be as good as I hoped it would, and it's one that Xbox owners should definitely check out. So there you go, a butt ton of 3D platform games, some of which were from previous videos, hope you don't mind. There's a load more out there, so which ones should I look at if I do a part 2 of this theme? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you want to feature in a future video, also drop me a line. Now all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.